For this weekend's shipwreck video, we return to the recent Guadalcanal expedition by the team aboard Nautilus. Last weekend, we looked to Yudachi, a Japanese destroyer, and by far the most deteriorated of any wreck surveyed in that expedition. Today, on the other hand, we'll be looking at a much better preserved wreck, USS Vincennes, one of the 4 cruisers lost at Savo Island. This ship endured a horrific pounding in her actions that night, and her wreck shows that quite well. She's peppered with shell holes, including a very notable one on the extreme stern. A stern that has collapsed pretty badly on top of the other damage. Now, I've covered Vincennes or Vincennes before. However, that was based on the survey by Petrel Album's team, then operating off his yacht Octopus. They found the wreck in 2015, but didn't release much material. That was still enough to get a good idea of the ship's condition. The Nautilus survey, meanwhile, was live streamed as they do, and given a dedicated video on their channel, which I'll of course link in the description. That allows us to look at the entire wreck and compare it to the earlier 2015 survey. Almost exactly a decade passed between those two looks, and it's interesting to see the differences. And there are differences, even if they're not quite as big as between the two surveys of Yudachi. You can see one of the notable ones here at the bow. I'll return to this later and point out the major changes, but I'll leave this here if you want to try picking them out yourself. That aside, since I have covered this wreck before, I'm only going to give the brief details of her sinking. That sinking came on August 9th, 1942, at the Battle of Savo Island. Vincennes was one of several Allied cruisers ambushed that night, alongside her sisters, Quincy and Astoria, all 3 of which were sunk, as well as USS Chicago and HMAS Canberra operating in a different group. Chicago would survive, Canberra would not. At this point, the cruiser's wreck was lost to time. She wouldn't be located by Robert Ballard's 1990s surveys, unlike Quincy. Instead, Vincennes would have to wait for 2015 when Petrel Album's team surveyed Ironbottom Sound. The wreck they found was in rough but recognizable shape. The bow was gone and much of the bridge had fallen away. And of course, the stern was collapsed, as I noted earlier. Despite this, all the turrets remained in place, and the hull, bow aside, was in more or less one piece. In the intervening decade, not a lot has changed on the wreck. When Nautilus returned in July 2025, they found a wreck in more or less the same condition. There's not a lot of extra deterioration compared to the previous look. Her relatively deep depth, around a kilometer down, likely helps there. In any event, where I can, I'll make direct comparisons between the two surveys. One area I can't do this, however, is the bridge, so I'll put the octopus shot here just for completion's sake. This fell away from the rest of the wreck and landed in the mud. We can't see much here other than the overall structure and some bridge windows. It's an interesting look, but since it's the only look, let's move on to the Nautilus survey. As with the Yudachi video last weekend, I'll do this in stages, starting with the weaponry, then the remaining superstructure, bridge aside of course, and then the hull. With all that sorted, let's begin with the forward main battery turrets. Vincennes carried 3 triple 8-inch gun turrets, 2 on the bow and 1 on the stern. We got a good look at all of these in both surveys, and it's here where we return to that picture from earlier, where I can point out the differences if you didn't spot them before. First, we have the view from Octopus in 2015. We only really see the number 1 turret in any detail, and even then, mostly the barrels and a little bit of the turret face. The number 2 turret is out of frame. Still, there is one thing I want to focus on, that being the debris. There's some here on top of the turret, covering up much of the turret face and the roof. And there's more here where the bow broke. Between the two, you can't see the front of the turret very well, though the barrels are intact and poking out. Now let's move forward a decade to the Nautilus survey. We don't have an exact one-to-one replication of the octopus picture, but this one is pretty close. And I think you'll quickly note that the debris is gone. Instead of being practically buried in broken steel, the turret is mostly clean. The barrels haven't really changed much by comparison, but that's not as noteworthy. The missing debris is. In both cases, it's the single biggest difference for a decade worth of deterioration. Beyond this, as we move forward, you won't see much change at all. It's a striking difference when compared to how much Yudachi fell apart. Though, before we move on, a quick note. I'm sure at least someone will comment that this is evidence of illegal salvage or the like. It isn't. Not only is this wreck too deep to easily reach, if she were being torn apart, suffice it to say there would be a lot more evidence than some missing debris. With that detour aside, let's look a bit down on the turret. This shows two things: the continued missing debris and the bow break. Neither of those or the turret itself are very clear. It's too dark and out of focus, but it is a good preview of later looks, such as here where more of the break is visible. It does look like the debris has fallen down over the years, but I can't say with 100% certainty that's the same stuff from 2015. As for the number 1 turret itself, there's not much in the way of notable damage, neither from below or above. It's mostly intact, with the barrels elevated up. It's hard to say why, due to the chaos of that battle, though you see a similar elevation on Quincy's wreck, so it's not at all unique here. The only damage I can pick out is a missing rangefinder ear. It's too faint to tell for sure beyond that, though there might be shell damage. That would match up with hit number 5 on the damage plate. On the other hand, the second turret's barrels are flat. You can faintly see them here, but in the next couple images, we'll look at that turret closer. Very close, in fact, with this one. Again, the turret itself is intact, from the barbette to the turret itself, and even the deck around it has preserved wood, though we do see our first shell hole here. It's a fairly small impact all told, but it did punch clean through the armor. Meanwhile, the barrels are, as noted, fine, flat and hanging out over the number 1 turret, with no signs of visible damage to them. That said, when looked at from this angle, we can see how the first turret is trained out very slightly, which is why the images from head-on look a bit crooked. And on the topic of the first turret, we see the structure better here. No shell holes, no major rusting. For all intents and purposes, it's in one piece from this side. All the more impressive considering the bow breaking off right in front of it. The second turret, for its part, does have more visible rusting. The back is pretty overgrown, and the rangefinder ears are full of silt and rusticles. And when you move to the starboard side, you can see more damage. The rust is much more apparent for one, and there's shell impacts to the side here. Impacts, but not penetrations. We see those a bit better here. This one in particular is rather large. though the rangefinder ear and a ladder are both still there. On the other side of the turret, however, there's a visible shell penetration. We can see a hit in that area on the damage plate, and more importantly, it's an area we saw in 2015. Here we got a nice and close-in look. Again, there's not really an equivalent shot from Nautilus, but this one from further out works. Not much has changed. It hasn't notably rusted out, and looks almost identical. It's also where we start to wrap up the bow turrets. The rest of the images are different angles on what we saw before, such as the turret face of turret 2 here, or the starboard side of turret 1 still showing no visible shell impacts, while the barrels just show a better look at their elevation, or from further down the lack of debris compared to 2015, with the final look at the number 1 turret mostly being interesting for, well, a crab, in the same position as the octopus survey. I just found that a bit amusing and a nice break from the sobering look at what is a gravesite. The last look at the bow turrets, meanwhile, is of the roof of turret 2, where the faint remnants of a paint stripe are still visible. With that covered, it's time to move back to turret 3. This one is interesting. Vincennes' entire aft superstructure was wrenched out and fell on top of it. The damage plate shows multiple hits to that structure, so I'm not terribly surprised by this. Nonetheless, it's buried the stern turret. Even from closer in, you still can't see all of it. That's true here in 2025, and it was equally true in 2015. Though, interestingly, not much has actually changed. Even the rusticles on the tips of the barrels are the same. Maybe a bit bigger, but not by much. That said, we do see things a bit better now, such as here, where the turret face is completely covered at the top. We'll be returning to the aft superstructure later, however, so let's move down, to where, much like Quincy, the entire stern barbette is exposed. Most of that should be buried beneath the deck. So this is our first glimpse of how badly that's collapsed, though the turret itself is in one piece. Even closer in, there's no apparent damage here, aside from the deck damage. The turret roof is, in the same vein, mostly fine, though we see more debris here, including this shiny bit that Nautilus identified as funnel liner, while the back of the turret is similarly in one piece. It's also our last good look at the stern turret because the rest is completely buried. Either way, let's move on to the lighter weaponry, starting with the 5-inch secondaries. I won't spend as long on this because there's less unique details. For better or worse, these look about the same as any 5-inch single mounting on an American shipwreck, covered in silt and rusticles with the shape of the weapon clearly visible, along with the wrecked remains of the mount itself. There aren't many details to pick out. Not on the mount, not on the gun shield, and not on the deck in the background. Though it does seem to have ready ammunition storage, if I'm not mistaken, here. But that's about it. Although we do see this exact mount in the 2015 survey, where very little, if anything, has changed in the intervening decade. There's not much notable increase in rust, silt, or marine growth. It's practically identical again. The other gun photographed in 2015 for its part doesn't have as close a look in 2025. I believe it's this one, but I can't say for sure. While the other 5-inch guns are all in basically the same shape as the first one, just in different orientations, with the more distinct bits coming in the background, such as here where we have a lot of torn cabling. This was the searchlight platform, and those cables likely relate to that. Beyond this, There's not much to note for the secondary battery, though at least this one is pointing out. The last two are both pointing inward, though I couldn't begin to tell you why. This one is slightly elevated, while this one is completely flat. They might have been twisted around during the sinking, but I can't say for sure. The 20mm guns, meanwhile, have even less to touch on. We don't get a good close-in look at those. They're covered in rusticles, and that's about the most I can say. These are at the base of the bridge tower, and we see them in 2015 as well, though not this one alone on the deck. However, that's about it, so let's wrap up this section on the stern, where we have two very inclined Chicago piano mounts. The quad 1.1-inch cannon, where the deck collapsed beneath them. We don't see these in 2015, though there was a similar mount from the bridge here. As for the stern pair, they're mostly intact, just angled straight up due to the deck not being in one piece. It's a very striking look, to say the least. You rarely see something like this, where a collapsed deck has led to weapons pointing straight up. Although it did give a great look at the top of this mount, where you have a mix of rusted out mount and shiny steel parts, the magazine wells and the barrels themselves, both of which are remarkably clean, all things being equal. That applies to both mounts, by the way, as you can see from the side here, which also wraps up this fairly lengthy look at the weaponry. Now for the superstructure, such as it is. We'll start here on the bridge area. There's not much to note really. We have the frames that supported a 5-inch gun mount. Not much beyond this, aside from a couple shell impacts here and here. The reason I picked this shot is because it's the closest we have to this look from Octopus. Not identical, no, but the best comparison we have. Meanwhile, a bit further along, we have 3 more shell impacts. 1 to the side, and 2 to the deck. One of which tore a chunk out of the deck on the way to hit the superstructure. As we continue further back, we return to the 5-inch guns, and more specifically, the area behind them. First, the searchlight platform, which looks like it received a shell hit here. While just ahead of there, we have the hole where the forward funnel would have been located. It's completely gone, leaving a gaping void into the ship. The same applies to the aft funnel here, though we do get a better look inside at least. And nearby, we also have the base of a catapult. This is mostly intact, though the catapult itself fell away. You can see it in 2015 here. That said, on the back side, we do have some notable bending where the ladder is. And we also see an entrance next to a spare anchor. That anchor has remained in place, still lashed to the side, where it was also photographed back in 2015. The main difference here is some more debris by the entrance, including the remnants of its door. The deck is still intact though, wood and all, which cannot be said for the aft superstructure. You can clearly see where it was torn away here, leaving a gaping gash in the deck. That structure is crumpled in and collapsed over the aft turret as established earlier. But looking at it in more detail, well, when I say crumpled in, I do very much mean it. Basically nothing is recognizable, at least until you reach the upper levels, where some portholes and walkways become apparent. But even then, there's not much to say. It's all busted up by the collapse and the Japanese shell fire. Even the top has more of that apparent funnel liner stretched over it. Despite that damage, however, there is one 20mm gun here, hanging on for dear life as the rest of the structure collapsed around it, while the starboard side does have some more recognizable parts, in the sense that it isn't crumpled metal at least. Even so, it's still not that much better. So let's leave the superstructure here and move to the hull to wrap up this lengthy video. We'll start with the bow, or at least what's left of it. This was torn off in the sinking, and it shows. The area on the main hull is a mess of twisted metal, from far out or from closer in. There's not much recognizable. While up by the turret, we have bent steel pressed up against it. This debris here might be what we saw in 2015. It's tough to say without a better look from that older survey, but it's certainly possible. Regardless, when we move further down, you return to, how is this intact at all? Everything is torn up from what seems to be a pretty violent breakup. This is nothing like the splits on Wasp, which were quite clean. This is a much more typical broken bow with all that implies. On both sides, actually, as the port side of the break shows here. Even if some of the metal at the front of the turret is more bent rather than torn. Meanwhile, as we move along the port side, we see a lot of shell holes. The ship was peppered by Japanese shell fire, and a lot of those shell holes are still visible. Some more rusted than others. And these aren't just in the side either. They extend further up towards the gun tubs for the 5-inch guns as well. Basically, no part of Vincennes was spared shell fire. Despite this, the most notable damage isn't the bow or the shells. It's the stern, where we see the crumpled in part here by the stern turret. Not only has it fallen inward, there's a very clear crack in the side by the prop guard. A crack that extends down to the prop itself. I'm honestly surprised the stern didn't break off too, looking at how far this goes. The prop, meanwhile, was also photographed in 2015. The main difference in the past decade is that it got buried deeper in the mud. Not much else has changed that we can see. Moving beyond here, we'll wrap up this video on the stern, where the entire structure has crumpled in, both the deck and the stern bottom. This implosion-looking damage is a common theme on all three American cruisers, as we'll see with Astoria and Quincy. Vincennes, meanwhile, has some very rough damage here. It's bent and buckled badly, and yet, despite this, the most famous damage to the wreck is still to come. That being this, the massive shell hole in the stern. Another aspect we saw in 2015, and another area where very little has changed. Even the remnants of the paint are the same. It seems a good point to end this lengthy look at USS Vincennes, if you ask me. Her most distinctive feature between the two surveys. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.